How do you market your podcast? Today's guest is Aoife O'Brien, host of the Happier at Work podcast. You're going to hear how she is using podcast guesting and LinkedIn, among others, to get her podcast known among her ideal listeners. You're going to get a short email that you can use to send to potential guests, as well as lots of other great tips to implement in your own podcasting. I'm Alison Fraser, host of Women Who Podcast, the show for side hustling women who are ambitious but time limited. Each week, I bring you real life stories and actionable tips to help you create and grow your own podcast. Let's get into it. Aoife, welcome on to Women Who Podcast.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Alison. It's great to be here. I know this has been in the pipeline for a couple of months now, and that the timelines align right now. So it's really great to be here. Thank you so much.
No worries. I have seen you on Threads, and when you mentioned about coming on my show, I'm like, yes, because I was going to reach out to you myself. So yeah, definitely everything's all come together. So this is great. And we're going to go straight into talking about marketing your show, because you said before that, people ask you all the time. So let's get into that and how you make it work for you.
Absolutely. And people ask me, and my common response up to a little while ago was always, I just promote the shit out of it, basically. I just promote it everywhere. And I think I'm learning a thing or two as I go along. So I certainly talk about every single episode when it comes out. And from the guest side, I like to make sure that the guest experience is the best. And then I obviously would ask them to rate and review my show as well every time. So the ratings and the reviews are good to talk about in social media. For me, I think the brilliant thing about having a podcast is that you don't run out of content to talk about. There's always something to post about. So if I think about in terms of my marketing strategy, so one of the things that I do that's a little bit different to anyone else, and someone who's a LinkedIn expert kind of questioned me a little bit about this, as in she was like, that's really strange. I've never seen people with two LinkedIn business pages. So I have a page for my business, but I also have a separate page for my podcast. That means that every single time I talk about my podcast, I can tag my podcast, and I set up a LinkedIn newsletter for my podcast. So it doesn't have a huge number of subscribers, but in terms of ratio of number of followers of the page versus the number of subscribers to the weekly newsletter, I think it's going pretty well. LinkedIn also allows you to post or to embed from Spotify. And I think there is one other platform that you can use to embed the podcast directly into that newsletter. So I embed the podcast, I do the show notes, I do all the links, I tag everyone who is relevant for the podcast as well. I link back to previous episodes. So that's kind of one thing that I do that's maybe a little bit different. But one of the things that I really wanted to talk about today is a fantastic way of marketing your podcast by going on other people's podcasts. And I think it's something that is underrated at the moment, or it's not something we think about. But if you already have a podcast, there's a huge opportunity for you to do a podcast swap. And you can also decide whether or not, so if someone asks you to be on their podcast, you can also decide whether or not it's a good opportunity for you. You don't have to say yes to all of the opportunities, but maybe we can have a chat about how to decide or where to find podcasts that are relevant, or how to approach people, or something like that. Because if you imagine, if you can find podcasts that have a similar audience to your own, it's in both of your interests to do a podcast swap so that you can both grow your audiences. And, I've seen it written somewhere, get people where they are. And if people are listening to another podcast and you mention your podcast, the easiest thing for them to do is to go into their podcast app and search for your podcast, rather than saying, oh, my website is this, or follow me on LinkedIn. And for me, especially, I have to spell out my name every time I say follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn. But I think using podcast guesting is a really great strategy to grow your own show.
Yeah. And I love that going on to other people's shows, because You are wanting to find the people where they are at. I've heard it on other podcasts as well about, growing your show. Oh, it is easier to get someone who already listens to a podcast to listen to your podcast than to try to find someone who is interested in your subject but isn't necessarily a podcast listener already.
Yeah, they're not necessarily a podcast listener already, or they're interested in this subject, but do they take the time then to reach out and connect with you via social media, or are they watching your social media and they're like, exactly like you said, Alison, are they actually looking for podcasts to listen to, or are they just not interested in podcasts whatsoever?
Yeah. So what tips then do you have for finding a podcast that suits you and your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, first of all, this has been something that I found hard, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that struggle with this as well, is clearly defining who is your ideal listener. And I think when I first started, and up until quite recently, I was quite broad and it was like, oh, it's for HR and leaders. And, I thought that was being really specific. But if I'm being brutally honest with myself, I'm like, that's not really that specific. So now I'm trying to grow my business. I'm trying to tighten down my messaging and think about who really is it that I want to target with my podcast. And it's people in those global head of talent roles. So large organization responsible for talent development, talent retention, all of those really interesting things. And I know that I can help them with those. I'm doing some research at the moment to really understand what those key pain points are. So I think getting a better understanding of who is it really that you want to listen to the show, and how can you be as specific as possible when it comes to that. And YouTube is another avenue, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later, but YouTube is another avenue that I'm exploring this year. So a couple of years ago, I spent a good bit of time uploading all of my previous episodes because I had the video. Well, for most of them, I had the video. So I spent a good bit of time uploading all of those videos onto YouTube. And then it was sort of like crickets. Okay, right. There's not a lot happening on YouTube, but I know that YouTube is an opportunity for me to grow. And I'm getting a bit of traction with YouTube Shorts, for example. But the reason that I'm bringing YouTube into it is I downloaded this, it's not even, it is an AI. I was going to say it's not even an AI. It's an AI app that you can use, and it helps you with the titles and it helps you with the description and with tags and things like that. But they also do some sort of a training so that you can get really clear on who it is. And the training I did yesterday was all about that ideal listener. And it's about talking to just one person. So give that person a name, give that person some characteristics, like what are they interested in? And then what kind, and this was even a challenge for me because I gave the name Sarah. I said she's 39 and she works in a global head of talent role. And then I put myself in Sarah's shoes and I thought, well, what's Sarah actually watching? What's she looking for when she goes to YouTube? Is it interviews? And I had to be brutally honest. It was kind of like, no, it's more like frameworks and inspiration. And like, why is she going to YouTube actually? So if you think about that for your podcast, give the person a name, give them some characteristics, really think about why they are tuning into this podcast to begin with. Another thing that I've started to look at recently is the consumption level on your podcast episodes. So your podcast host may have those consumption levels, or your like Apple definitely has them, and I think Spotify has them as well. So you can look at the percentage that people are consuming. You can see if you've got ads on the podcast, are they skipping through the ads? If you have a generic outro at the end or a generic intro, you can see if they're skipping through those. And I want to get much cleverer about the length of my podcast episodes as well. So mine are typically 45 minutes. Is that too long? So we've kind of gone off on a slight tangent, but thinking about really clearly defining who is it that you want. And then you can use that information to search key terms, and you can search those terms in Apple, you can search them in Spotify. There's another great tool called Listen Notes. And if you haven't already claimed your podcast on Listen Notes, it's a really good idea to claim your podcast. You can see the score of Listen Notes attributes a score to your podcast. It tells you what percentage you're in. If you're within the top 10%, it will tell you which percentage you're in globally when you compare to other podcasts as well. So searching out those podcasts, I think, is a really great first step. Obviously, then you need to reach out to someone. But I always think if you have your own podcast, the opportunity to do a podcast swap, I think is you have, let's say, a better opportunity than someone else who doesn't have a podcast, who's just trying to pitch to be on their podcast. But I would look for ones that have maybe a similar ranking or maybe slightly better ranking than you have, rather than trying to get in the top 0.5% of podcasts. So kind of be a bit more realistic. If you imagine how many pitches you get to be on your own podcast, and, I'm talking to kind of listeners now to say how many people reach out to you on a regular basis, well, then times that by 100 or 1,000 for the ones that are being pitched in the top 0.5%. So you really need to stand out, I think. I think being realistic about it as well. So not everyone is going to say yes. So is there a way that you can keep track of which ones you've reached out to, who you need to follow up with? And again, don't be that annoying person who's always following up. And like, I've had people who message me and then maybe 2 days later do a follow-up message when I haven't even had a chance to read that first message. And I suppose it's a little bit off-putting. So there are some of the things that you can use. So I think finding keywords, you can also look for competitors' names as well and do a search for those in any of those apps. There's another one as well called Podchaser, which is good. And again, if you haven't claimed your podcast on Podchaser, you can do searches there. You can also, I haven't used this myself, but you can search for sponsorship opportunities through Podchaser as well. So yeah, it's really about finding what those keywords are that you want to be known for. So for me, now that I'm a bit clearer on the kinds of podcasts that I want to be on, it's thinking about the talent, global talent manager or some, if I did a search for that in Apple, for example, or I find Spotify a little bit easier from a search perspective, personally speaking. But I think with the new iOS update, I think Apple has got a little bit better. But yeah, finding those words and plugging them into those search engines and finding podcast opportunities, have a listen to them. There's so many podcasts that I already listen to that I would love to be a guest on. But then, finding more opportunities or reaching out to people and just with a simple phrase of, and someone did this to me recently, what's your process for taking guest applications? Rather than wasting your time doing a really long, funny, clever pitch, and then you either get zero response or you get a generic response because it's a copy paste that you've probably sent to someone. So having that opportunity to understand, well, what is their process around taking guest applications to begin with?
That's actually a really good idea. And it's short. It doesn't take a long time.
Yeah.
And you will either get we're not taking guest applications.
Exactly.
And it's less of a knockback.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's something, interestingly, so I do run a program. It's kind of, I was going to say it's separate to my business. It's part of my business still, but it's not the main part of my business, but it is all around podcast guesting. So podcast guesting mastery. And interestingly, one of the ladies on it said, listen, I want to reach out to this podcaster. And it was someone who I knew, who I don't have a very favorable opinion of, let's say, because of interactions that I've had directly with her. And she said to me, this is what I'm thinking of writing. Can you give me some feedback and let me know what you think? And I kind of, and this was based on recommendations. I was saying, oh, we need to do this. But when it came to the crunch, I said, actually, do you know what? I think you'd be better off saying, I saw that you just recently launched season 4 and I know that you do it in person. What's your process for guest applications? I'm based in the UK. I'm happy to fly to Dublin, whatever. And yeah, she hasn't got a response, but it just got me thinking of that. And then I heard it separately somewhere else. And I was like, right, I have to share this now with the people who are in my group. A much, much better approach of just getting straight to the point and saying, what is your process for guest applications? And I'm certainly going to start doing that now and implementing that in my business.
Have you had people contact you to be on your podcast using that process?
I had one person contact me to say, can you let me know what the process is or something? You know, a lot of people will flatter you and say, actually, an email I got just this morning, and he was, I think, trying to pitch his services to me, but he's like, I saw your recent interview. It was so good. He doesn't say what interview, he doesn't say where he saw it. And then at the end, he's obviously left a blank space that he hasn't filled. And he goes, how about I could get you much better podcast than, and he was supposed to have filled out a space and he didn't fill it out. So like, to me, that's it's an instant fail. And I feel like replying and say, oh, which interview was that? And to which he'll say, your latest one, because I had that on LinkedIn as well. Your latest article was brilliant. I'm like, oh, which one? Your latest one. I'm like, no, sorry, you didn't even take time to look at my profile. But the majority of people reach out and they do a long-winded, it's all about me and my book and my podcast and my expertise. What you need to do is flip the thinking and put the thinking more on the recipient and say, who are the listeners? What are the listeners interested in? What pain point can I solve for the listeners when they are tuning into this episode of the podcast, and really put the focus on them? And I always like to think of it as well, what's in it for me, you know? Mm-hmm. And so when you're thinking about reaching out to someone, think about, well, what's in it for the podcast hosts themselves? Like, why should they care? Why should they listen? And I think once you break down that initial barrier of, yes, we are taking applications and here's the process, or just send me an email with some details, then you can go into a bit more specific. But it's less about you and more about the listener. What does the listener stand to gain from the conversation? I don't care that you've written 10 books. I don't care about all of those subjects. You need to make it so easy for me to relate what you're going to talk about to the problem that my listeners might have. And for me specifically, it'll be some sort of workplace related problem. There are some that capture my attention that I want to say yes straight away. And I've had 2 of those recently, and I'll have to read through them again to really get to it. But I think it was just softly approach. And I think maybe that comes from understanding who the host is as a person. So the really aggressive type of approach and like, really, if you're going to send me a 2-page email and then an attachment with a 1-sheet or a 1-pager, like, I'm not going to read it. I'm sorry. And that is probably something that's copy pasted to 1,000 other people. So I'm going to do a reply and I'm going to do a copy paste of my templated email that says, thank you so much. There is an application process. We're currently reviewing guests for about 6 months out, because that is normally the case. And here's the link, and we'll be in touch if we think it's a good fit.
Wow, 2-page email.
I don't know. Yeah. You're just scrolling and scrolling for days. And it's like, it's all about me and my book. And I think another thing when you're reaching out to people is the point I made earlier about making it really easy for them to make the connection between what you're talking about and what's in it for the guest. But beyond that, it's doing the heavy lifting and not saying, and here's 5 topics I could talk about. It's like, no, I've taken the time, I've listened to your podcast, and here's one topic I think either you haven't had it on recently or you haven't had it on at all. And here's why it's important. And I think here's some very specific takeaways that the audience will have after our conversation, rather than giving people a choice. Someone contacted me recently and said, I want one of my executives, I'm not sure which one yet, and here's like 10 different topics. And I'm like, no, come back to me, listen to the podcast, come back to me. You need to tell me who you want to be on the podcast, and you need to tell me what subject you want to talk about. Don't let me go through all of your information, and that gives me extra work to do, and then decipher what it is that you're trying to say. So I think just make it easy. Like, one of my big things is make it easier for people to do what you want them to do.
It's almost putting you back into that HR position yourself of having to sift through job applicants and choosing which one you want.
This is it. Make it easy. And like, again, if you're thinking about from a work perspective, a recent conversation that I had with someone on the podcast, and we talked about making your manager's job easy. So if you're afraid to promote yourself, if you're afraid to talk about all the brilliant things that you do, shift the perspective to, I'm making my boss's job easier by telling them all of the things that I'm talking about, or all of the successes that I'm having in my job, in my career, on this specific project. So you're making their life easier by letting them know, here's all the things, so that they can summarize that to their bosses, that they can share what's going on for you when they're in those important rooms. And so it just makes their job easier.
I think it can be quite hard though for us as women podcasters. You mentioned, and I think it's actually in that same episode, about notions in Ireland and tall poppy syndrome in
the tall
Australia
poppy syndrome,
and New Zealand. Yeah, the whole.
Yeah.
You don't want to big yourself up because people will cut you down. But when you are pitching yourself for a podcast, you kind of have to do that, don't you? As you say, you have to make that podcaster's, the host's job easier.
You have to make the host job easier, but you don't have to big yourself up. You know, you don't have to say, I'm in this, or my podcast has this number of downloads, or my podcast. I think that's less relevant than the conversation that you can have and the value that you can add to listeners. So if you put the focus not on yourself, but rather on the listeners and the impact, and again, that's something that you can use in work as well, that the focus is on the impact that you're having and the success. You're not saying that's all down to me, but you're putting the focus onto, and here are the results, you know, and oftentimes we put our head down and we want the results to speak for themselves. But if we don't tell anyone what the results are, then they're not going to know what those results are. So coming back to podcasting, I think, again, it's this idea of putting the focus on, how are you going to help listeners? Like what are 3 things that listeners will walk away from after listening to this episode of the podcast? But I think being on a podcast, this is kind of, I suppose, the third element. So you're on the podcast and you want people to take that next step. The easy next step is go and check out my podcast as well. You know, you've got your podcast app, open it up and search for my podcast, add some recent episodes. But after the podcast comes out, it's, again, this might come up where we're like, oh, I don't want to be talking about myself. And what I found and podcasters will know this, if you have interview guests, and I do everything I can to provide them with absolutely everything they will need to promote the podcast. I've recently started using an AI tool that produces videos. So I've got like between 15 and 25 videos for every single episode. And I give them suggested social media posts that they can use. They just need to copy paste and tag, and, you know, they might modify 1 or 2 things. I give them quotes and sound bites and all sorts of things from the episode itself as well. So I give them so much, and oftentimes they don't promote. But one of the things that I used to do with the video was just have them in the video, and people did not post that. They didn't post if it was just them. And I think this, again, is, we don't want to seem like we're promoting ourselves. We don't want to seem like we're just talking about how brilliant we are. So all of my new AI videos have myself and the person in them. I think they're still a little bit reluctant to promote themselves using video. For me, I think it's a really great opportunity. And being a guest on a podcast and talking about being a guest on a podcast shows other people that you're interested and that you're knowledgeable and that you're a thought leader. And then if they're a podcaster, they could potentially invite you to be on their podcast as well.
There's so much the good stuff there, Aoife. I'm going to have to go back I will be going back and when I do my editing, but just implementing some of those things that you mentioned there. Yeah. I think we do. I think, for some people who are podcasters, they do the podcast and then they don't want to talk about it because it's all me.
Yeah. I think you have to, and like, not everyone who has a podcast has their own business. And maybe this is something that I've learned from having my own business. But you kind of have to talk about what you do. You kind of have to put yourself out there. Now, like I said, not everyone has their own business, but the same applies in work. You have to be comfortable with talking about what it is that you're doing. And like I said, think about it as not promoting yourself or whatever you want to do. And I've just finished reading this amazing book about personal branding and what it means and why it's so important. And your energy and who your detractors are and all of these amazing concepts. So we're so afraid of what other people will think and how other people will judge us. But I think if you do that and think about it from the perspective of, I'm doing this to make my boss's job easier. However, when other people see me doing that, they're going to judge me. Okay, that's fine. When I start getting the results and the recognition and the promotion, they might change their mind.
Yes. You're going to have to tell me the name of that book, Aoife, because I will want to read it, and I'll stick it in the show notes. You can tell me afterwards.
It's called Your Brand, but it has this thing on it. Like, the publisher is the Chartered Accountants of Ireland. So I'm like, I did try and find it on Amazon, and I couldn't find it. So I don't know, is it one of those random limited publishing type of things, or only for accountants or something like that, which I'm not, by the way. But it was given to me by my sister-in-law, who's also not an accountant. So I don't know where she got it from. But it's called Your Brand, and it's by Veronica Canning. And I just took so much away from it. I thought it was a really great way to think about a building block of building your personal brand. And I love to think of personal brand as, it's, maybe you don't want to have a personal brand, but you have one no matter what. It's what people say about you when you're not there. And you can influence that narrative about what people talk about you, or you can just let people say whatever it is they want.
Yeah, very true. You are obviously so well versed in pitching to other podcasts and helping other people pitch themselves. How many do you aim for? Like, do you aim for a certain amount a month, or do you set yourself a goal for a year?
If I can be brutally honest, I will say I haven't been very strategic about it up to now. One thing I did a couple of years ago was write out a list, and these were very specific HR podcasts when I thought, HR is where I want to focus on. And now I've had this kind of epiphany where it's like, it's not HR really. And a lot of what I can see about HR is it's very policy driven, employment law, that kind of thing, rather than the strategic. And that's not to say they're all like that, but I think there are some of them that are quite like that. I am planning this year to be much, much more strategic about it and measure. And I think what I would do is set myself a target of 30. And you have to think about what's realistic as well. I'm in various different podcasting groups, and people say, well, I had 5 podcast recordings today. I'm like, I wouldn't record my own podcast for five people on my own podcast in a day. I do maximum 3, and even 3 is like, at the end of it, I'm like, that's, and it's only podcasting for the day. I don't try and do any other work in between. But it's a lot. It takes it out of you. So I think about what's realistic for you. Is 1 a week realistic? And therefore that's 50 in a year. And if you're going for 50 in the year, then how many do you need to reach out to in order to get 50 yeses? This is the other thing. Like, 50 seems like quite a lot, actually. I'm going to aim for 30 between now and this time next year. So I won't say till the end of the year, but I will say from now until this time next year. But I also want to be really strategic about what ones I reach out to, and also when I get invited, which ones I say yes to, because I tend to say yes. I'm a bit of a people pleaser. I'm like, yeah, of course I'll be on your podcast. And I this is another important thing, I think. And I still make this mistake. I'm human, and I say yes. And I'm like, I really should have challenged it, or decided, or said I wanted to talk about something different or whatever. But when it's not your area of expertise or what you want to be known for, and that's the only thing they want to talk about, I think you should say no. If it's and it's not to say that it's important the size of the audience that it has, but if it's not the right audience for you, then I think you should turn it down as well. So thinking really strategically about what you say yes to, because you might think, oh, it doesn't take that much time, but it's still an hour of your time. It's still an hour that you could be spending doing something else instead. So kind of come back to your point about, how many. I think I'm going to aim for 30 between now and the end of the year, which means I'm going to reach out to, I would say, 100 podcasts. So if you think about it like that, it probably won't be 2 a week. It'll probably be more stacked. I might do 5 and then take a break for a few weeks and then do another 5 or something, and do it that way. the other thing to bear in mind is if I want to be on 30 podcasts, like what counts towards that? Is that people saying yes? Because I know certainly on my podcast, people will be waiting 6 months before they actually can get a recording slot. And then it could be another few months before the episode comes out as well. So, kind of thinking about all of those factors that contribute to when the podcast is actually going to be out. And what you do. Here's another thing, like, what are you going to do? Like, could you potentially promote the podcast in a different way? And I've seen people saying record a video separately and post that video or use that video. Like, say if you have your phone on the side. Personally, I don't like that if you haven't asked permission of the podcaster to use a video, but you can certainly post and tag the host and say, oh, the episode won't be out for a few months, but we've recorded this episode today, or I'm excited to record this episode in a few weeks' time, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so many different variables too, as you say, with timings.
Yeah,
you don't really know what that you're applying to be on a podcast and they say yes, and then but the dates they got available, you might end up doing like 3 interviews in a week where you really only want to do one. But...
yeah. And I think so long as it's space, I suppose, so long as you have enough time, advance notice, then you can work some other things around. I think. I think it's all about planning in advance.
I feel really privileged to have you on then, Aoife. You sound like you're quite, I wouldn't say picky, but, you're clear as to what you want to be on and what you want to talk about. So,
well, thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah.
I'm honored. And and I'm learning heaps myself from that whole aspect of pitching to other podcasts and just that simple one line. I'm definitely going to be using that.
Yeah, no, it is. It's so good, isn't it? And it just happened to come up twice in 1 week where I was like, actually, do you know what? If I was reaching out to that person, realistically, I would ask, like, what's your process? Because I know she would be inundated with requests. So rather than, a whole spiel of this is why I'm so brilliant, which so many people tend to focus on, I'm like, I don't care why you're brilliant. Tell me what you're going to tell my audience. Tell me what's in it for them. Tell me what's in it for me. And if people take nothing else away from this episode, I think it's that really, getting really clever on that.
So tell us about Happier at Work.
Yeah, so I started Happier at Work, it's almost 5 years ago now, with a microphone and an idea, probably similar to a lot of people. I didn't have a plan. I didn't really have a strategy in place. I was a huge podcast fan. Like, I used to devour podcasts. I would listen to them commuting. I'd listen to them out for walks, all of that kind of thing. And I knew I had this idea. I was studying for a master's at the time and I wanted to share my ideas. And it just kind of evolved from there. When it came to inviting guests, you're very early. No one's heard of you. I just reached out to people in my network. And then I got braver and I reached out to people who were in newspapers or talking about things that would be relevant for my audience. And surprisingly, they said yes. And, this is the whole thing of you don't ask, you don't get. So you can just reach out to whoever you want to be on your podcast. I've had people who've said yes. And then I've just basically been ghosted as well. So they've said, yeah, I'd love to be on your podcast. And then I never hear from them again. I've had people who have said yes, and it's like, this is brilliant. And then I think be wary when you have people who have a huge following on social media, because you think, oh, they're going to promote it or I can promote it and I'm going to get loads more listeners for my show. That's not how it works. They're in it for themselves. And going back to our earlier point, Alison, like, why would you spend an hour on a podcast if you're not going to promote it? I'm not sure why someone would do that, but they typically, in my experience, they don't really promote it that much. So it's kind of evolved since there. Like I said, it was very much like, oh, it's for HR. Then it was like, oh, it's HR and business leaders. And now I'm like, no, I want to get really clear on who it's for. And again, I used to say, oh, there's 4 different aspects that we cover on it. Now I want to be really clear that it's career and culture. So from an individual's perspective, it's like how to manage your career better. And then from a leader's perspective, how to create that better workplace culture so everyone can thrive.
I bet so many people are going to want to send that to their own HR managers.
Do. Yeah. Absolutely. I would very much welcome that. Yeah. And this is the thing, isn't it? Where you're like, there's specific episodes. You're like, oh, there's an upcoming episode all about self-awareness. And I imagine that is the kind of episode where people will be like, is it really passive aggressive of me to send this episode to someone who is really like unself-aware? Yeah.
What you do is you send the episode that came out just before that one.
That is such a clever idea.
And then it's the next one that comes up for
that
them.
is next level. Dare
if
I
you
say.
want to be a bit sneaky.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
But it's available everywhere. So wherever you're listening to your podcast right now, it's available there. And I don't do the lazy man's option of automatically posting to YouTube. I did try that with Headliner a few years ago, and it's basically just a static image and sound. And I'm like, not sure I really want that. But I have and it's not even the RSS feed, but I do have a separate feed for the podcast specifically, and they're the videos that I manually upload onto YouTube. So it's a video of me and my guest, or me on my own speaking.
What's been the biggest lesson you've learned from podcasting?
I think, there's been so many, but I think to reiterate the point that I made a second ago is you don't ask, you don't get. So reach out to people who you think, like I reached out to Andy Ramage very early on. I think he was episode number 7. He would never have heard of me. I liked what he was doing. He was the founder of 1 Year No Beer. My friend was in 1 Year No Beer. She was raving about it. So he was kind of minor celeb at the time. I reached out to Andrew Barnes. Andy Ramage, I think was maybe episode 3 or 4. And then Andrew Barnes, I think was episode 7. And I'm on episode 200 and something now. So Andrew Barnes was in the paper in Ireland. He's Kiwi based, but he was in the paper in Ireland talking about the 4-day week. And I was like, that is something that my audience definitely wants to know about. So I reached out and he said yes. I was kind of like, oh. You know, when you reach out and you think, oh, he's never heard of me, he's definitely going to say no. So that's another really important thing. I think another thing worth mentioning is, and I get sucked into this too, because I'm only human, and it's like you're looking at the numbers and the downloads and, oh, wow. And, I recently did something a little bit different with my podcast. So I used to do a synopsis of the key points at the end, something I really enjoy doing, picking out the summary points and putting them together and sharing my own examples. I used to do those at the end of the podcast episode, and now I've split them into a bonus episode that comes out on Monday. So my podcast comes out on Friday. The bonus episode, which is essentially the same content, comes out on the Monday. And it has increased the download numbers, obviously. But I think the lesson is not to focus on the download numbers. If you're doing this for fun, that's fine. But if you're doing it for business, I think it's getting really clever about what the next step someone can take with you. And I'm still learning about that. What I find with people who want to work with me, if they've listened to a few episodes of the podcast, it's kind of a no-brainer. They'll just get in touch and they'll be like, we know we want to work with you. And that's it. Whereas if someone hasn't listened to the podcast or they've never heard of me, it's a bit more of it's a harder sell. So I think focusing on the metrics that are important to you. So me as a business owner, it's about the revenue that I can get from the podcast. And I mean that not from sponsorship, but it's from working with clients.
Yeah, the other way of making your podcast monetized, selling yourself.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. When you mentioned before, well, when we started talking about the start of Happier at Work, that you are obsessed with podcasts, you listen to them a lot on your commute. So
yeah.
You still obsessed with podcasts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't get as much time, I feel, to listen to them. It's really these days because I was going to say, let me think. Yeah, like I would have been when I was first listening to podcasts, when I first got into podcasts, I would have been commuting, I would have been going out for walks every day. But now I work from home a lot. So I kind of need to make an active decision to listen to podcasts, but I'm still a huge fan. I listen on Apple because I have an Apple, so I'll add things to my queue. my queue could be like 100 or 200 episodes long, and anyone who has an Apple knows the pain of clicking the wrong button and deleting your queue.
Yes.
But then if I want to listen to a podcast immediately, so if there's one that has just come out, or if I've seen one advertised, or if I want to listen to one, then I will do that on Spotify normally. I haven't figured out how to kind of do queues, and like I know you can do a playlist on Spotify. To me, it's not quite the same. It's not great as a podcast app, but Apple kind of annoys me sometimes as well. So yeah, still obsessed with podcasts. I listen to loads of different ones, and I'm always interested in finding new podcasts to listen to as well. I think for me, there are so many. So I think particularly for my field of interest, I'd love to curate some very specific podcast episodes to like, here is a podcast episode that will solve this very specific problem. And also think about, this is something I've learned recently as well, think about that from my own podcast perspective. So before even thinking about who I want as a guest, thinking about what answer, or what question is this episode going to answer for my audience, and think about it from that. And you can get that from SEO. You can have a look on Google, see what things people are searching for, and then answer that question on the episode, rather than like I have these, what I feel like are really deep, meaningful, inspirational, high connection type of conversations, but that I think have an impact on people. But like, how do you boil that down to what question does this answer?
Yeah. I was going to ask you if you could share a couple of your favorites, but it sounds like your list is going to be a mile long. So could you share like the last one you listened to? Or?
Yeah, so I'll share with you. Like for me as a business owner, one of my inspirational ones, if you like, is How I Built This with Guy Raz. Now I know that he's gone on to do like kind of a creative thing as well. So I think he has 2 podcasts going. But I always want to give a shout out to female podcasts as well. And ones that I've been on recently. So Lucy Gernon has a show, The Leadership 360. Faye Wallace is based in the UK. She's a really great podcast as well. Zoe Routh is based in Australia. She has a really great podcast. Yeah, and I saw something recently as well, which annoyed me, but also didn't surprise me. And I did think about this, and I had a conversation with someone about this as well, that there's stats to show that when women read books, we read books by both men and women. And when men read books, they typically read books by men. And it's the same in podcasting. So women listen to podcasts from both women and men typically listen to podcasts that are hosted by men. So I want to give a shout out to women. That's why I want to give out a shout out to women and other women podcasters. And, you know, I'll probably do a LinkedIn post about this and talk a little bit more about, I suppose, getting the perspective of men and what podcasts they listen to that are hosted by women, that maybe other men can listen to those podcasts as well.
I'm going to look out for that LinkedIn article. Because I can't remember. I think I saw it was like the top 10 podcasts in the world, and there were 2 that had women hosts on.
Yeah,
there was one that was a co-host. The woman was a co-host with a man, and I was like, well, that kind of doesn't count because it should be an all women. Like, if we want to claim it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you could probably cut them and slice them and whatever. And I responded to someone recently. I was tagged in someone's article saying exactly this. So I want to take her article, but I want to do a separate one of my own. So obviously give credit to her, but give a shout out and turned it into more of a question of, for the men in my audience, what female hosted podcasts do you listen to? And then for the women, can you recommend some podcasts that men would find interesting as well? But I was tagged in this, and then I tagged, I think, 15 other female hosted podcasts that I thought, another brilliant one from the US is What Works with Tara McMullen. Like, she's a fantastic writer. She has amazing way with the words. She's a fantastic speaker as well. But yeah, with the charts and everything, like, I regularly see just male dominate. It's just men. And I'm like, that was the other thing I was going to say, that someone called me out when I had my 15, and she said, "Oh, I see you're trying to do a positive thing here with positive intent, but actually your list is racially biased. So there's not enough people of color." Basically, it was the implication. I think I had maybe one or two people who weren't white. So she was calling me out on that. I was like, okay, that's my bad. And that's a lesson for me.
Yeah. I think we can all probably do a little bit better.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of us are trying our best at the time. But yeah, that was it. Maya Angelou, who said, when you know better,
when you
do
know
better.
do better. I love it. Yeah. Now that you know, now you can do better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good note to finish on. Aoife, we could probably talk for hours.
Yes, absolutely. I've loved this conversation. But if anyone, wants an informal chat, if anyone wants to reach out about podcasting, I always love to connect with podcasters, by the way. If you're interested in happiness at work, check out the Happier at Work podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. And I am looking for more subscribers on YouTube. This is
I'll put those links
an ongoing battle.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you have a course as well about podcast guesting. Can you
podcast guesting mastery? Yeah. So it covers. So I've run it twice live, and I'm going to turn it into an on-demand online course. So I'm planning to do that. I was like, oh, that's a job for May. And now May is here. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I fly back to Ireland next week. So I'm like, okay, so I have a week to get this course done. I have all of the material there already. It's really about what, a lot of what I talked about. What is it? Who are you? What is it that you want to be known for? What are the keywords that people might search to find you? How do you find the right and relevant podcasts? How do you know what podcasts to say yes to? So that's kind of the pitching element, and how to reach out. But I think now that I know about that reaching out, just to ask, what's your process? I think that makes the job 10 times easier. If, maybe it's 50 times easier just to reach out like that. And then the next part is like, what do you actually talk about when you're on the podcast? How do you get people to interact, to engage, to take that next step with you? How do you promote the podcast after it's out? How do you position yourself as someone who's a thought leader because you've been on another podcast or maybe several other podcasts as well? And then there's other kind of bonus aspects to it as well. So like there'll be case studies in the online course. I'm going to add a bit of bonus stuff to that as well. And so things like case studies, things like looking at the analytics and what's good and what's bad, and what to expect from it, how to measure the results, all of those kinds of things. So it'll be called Podcast Guesting Mastery. And I have it set up, but I just have to record and publish all of the content.
Wow, I'll be sure to promote that too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Aoife, for your time. This has been wonderful.
Thanks so much, Alison. It's been a pleasure getting to know you.
Thanks again, Aoife, for all your tips and thoughts. I've been using Aoife's email template in reverse, asking potential guests if they have a process for appearing on podcasts, so it can work both ways. I'd love to hear what successes you have from this, so please either tag me on Threads, Alison the Podcaster, or send me an email to alison@alisonfraser.co. All of Aoife's links are in the show notes, including to her podcast guest mastery course. Now, I'm not sure when I'll have another episode out. I'm still on the extended break, so in the meantime, keep on implementing and tell me all about your show. You've been listening to Women Who Podcast, the podcast for women with something to say.